The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Community webinar. My name is Helen and I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Carson, President of Envision IT, who will be talking to you about Extranet identity management and authentication for SharePoint on-premise, Office 365 and beyond. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC14. If we have time at the end of this webinar, we will have a Q&A session to answer some of your questions. If you have a question that you would like to ask Peter, type it into the question pane in the control panel. This webinar is being recorded and you will be notified by email when it's available online. I am now going to change you over to our today's presenter, Peter Carson. Hello, Peter. I hope you're all set and ready today.
Much. Let me just share my screen out here, so you should all be seeing the opening slide for my PowerPoint presentation. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Peter Carson. I'm the President of Envision IT. We're a gold partner located in Mississauga, Ontario, in Canada, actually across the pond from you. I'm also a SharePoint MVP and a virtual technical specialist with Microsoft Canada. As Helen mentioned, we'll be sharing the deck up both on our site and through the SPCC site. All of my contact information will be in there, so my email, peter@envisionit.com, my blog site, our public website, Twitter handle, etc. from there. So a quick overview from an agenda point of view, what we're going to be covering over the next hour. We'll do a very brief introduction of who Envision IT is. We're really going to be focused in on extranets. That's the topic for today. So we're going to take you through some different extranet scenarios, talk a bit about our Extranet User Manager, which extends the out-of-the-box experience from a SharePoint point of view. And then we're going to get hands-on and go through an actual on-premises demo. So imagine that you've got SharePoint installed within your environment. How do you expose that as an extranet? What does that look like? We're going to talk a fair bit about federation, which is separation of applications like SharePoint and how the authentication happens, whether that's Active Directory federation services or other approaches there. And then we're going to talk about Office 365, which is also a fantastic way of building an extranet without having to build and expose the infrastructure within your environment. We'll do a wrap-up in Q&A, but the Q&A will be open throughout the session. I've got a couple of my staff on the line here as well. They'll be answering questions as we go, and then if there's ones that we need to bring up as a group at the end, we'll hold that for the wrap-up and Q&A from there. So quick background on Envision IT. As I mentioned, we're a gold partner here in Canada. We build things like collaboration portals and intranets from a SharePoint point of view, and our focus is exclusively from a SharePoint perspective. But more so for today's talk, we're going to talk about our work where we've built public-facing websites on SharePoint as a web content management system, and often these public websites have an extranet component to them as well, and we've certainly built a lot of these over the years as well. This is an area of particular focus and specialty for us. So before I get into the session itself, though, I want to get a quick sense from the group in terms of what version of SharePoint people are currently using, just so I can guide through from that point of view. So let me open that poll up for you. So curious whether you're running SharePoint Server 2013, which is the latest version from Microsoft, been out, I guess, about 18 months or so now, running in Office 365, so in the cloud with SharePoint Online, or you're running an older version, SharePoint Server 2010, Foundations 2010 or 2013, or you're still back on MOS 2007 WSS 3.0. So I'll leave that poll open for about another 40 seconds or so. And it's interesting, we've been doing these webinars for some time now, just seeing the trends and differences, how certainly SharePoint Server 2013 has become well adopted, how people are starting to get in the cloud with Office 365. I'll leave that open for about another 10 seconds or so, and then I'll share the results back just so you can see within your peers who's doing what and what does that look like. Okay, let me close that out and share that. So we can see 42% running SharePoint Server 2013, so it's actually fairly impressive in terms of the uptake and adoption. It's certainly far exceeding Server 2010. Still a few folks back on Foundation 2010 or 2013. Surprisingly, usually I see a few people still on MOS 2007. Nobody here today, so that's interesting to see. But more interesting, really, is about a third of you folks have self-identified that Office 365 is an area that you're using now as well. So that's something that's certainly growing very quickly. I was at a Microsoft event just a couple of days ago. They were talking about the phenomenal growth of the cloud and how they've had 5 consecutive quarters of triple-digit growth from an Office 365 and cloud point of view. So that's phenomenal growth from a Microsoft point of view. All right, one more poll that I want to put up here, which is how you use SharePoint today. So I want to get a sense, are people using it from an internal collaboration point of view, which is typically how people start working with SharePoint. Are you using it from a publishing point of view, from an internal perspective? Or do you actually have an extranet already within your organization and you're looking to see how you can improve on that experience? So again, I'll give you about a minute to respond to that. Thank you. And then we'll share those results back out as well. All right, give you about 10 more seconds. All right, so let me just close that out and share those results back out. So again, not surprisingly, internal collaboration is where a lot of people start from a SharePoint point of view. So about half of you identified from that point of view. About a quarter, though, using it from a web publishing point of view, and another quarter already running extranets on there. So hopefully we've got some tips and tricks and ideas for you in terms of how you can improve that extranet experience going forward for those of you that are already there. For those of you that are interested but haven't dipped your toes in yet, absolutely lots of ideas and thoughts should be coming out from the session. Let me hide that. And we'll come back to our deck. All right. So I perhaps should have explained this beforehand, but I wanted to get a sense without sort of coaching people just what an extranet is. I'm assuming pretty much everybody on the call understands that, but not necessarily all business people do. And really what an extranet is a website accessible to users outside of your corporate network. So whether we're talking about customers, partners, vendors, donors, sponsors, volunteers, I mean, the possibilities are endless. You pick any type of organization, whether it's a private sector, public sector, government, not-for-profit organization. Everybody has the need to collaborate with people outside of their organization. And how do you do that? Do you strictly use email and you do document attachments back and forth? That quickly becomes unmanageable as the group size starts to increase. Do you do an ungoverned and unmanaged type of approach where people just get their credit card out and sign up for a Dropbox and start sharing documents that way? You know, again, as you get into a bigger organization, that has a lot of risk associated with it, a lack of control around that experience. We're going to talk about different scenarios and how we do that. Now, the extranet doesn't need to be something unto itself. It could be that you just want to expose a portion of your intranet externally. We often see this from a board of directors portal point of view. You want to bring the directors in to a particular area of the site that's secure and private to them. Or it may be purpose-built, that you want to build a customer portal and you're bringing thousands or tens of thousands of customers in. You want to obviously keep that separate and secure from your intranet that your corporate staff are using. So lots of different levels and scales and approaches, and we're going to touch on different scenarios around that. So let's look at scenarios specific to SharePoint. You know, SharePoint is a great tool for both publishing information. You may not even want to collaborate with your external parties. You may just want to do secure publishing out to them for private information, or you want to actually have them engage and author and collaborate with you in that SharePoint portal. So let's start first with how are people going to authenticate? How do they sign into your portal is the first step in the question. So if we look at on-premises SharePoint and the authentication options there, now our first option is the standard out of the box that you get when you first set up SharePoint, Windows Authentication. So this is using Active Directory in either Claims or Classic mode under the site. And when somebody goes to sign in, they're prompted by their browser for their credentials, or if they're inside the network, typically they don't even see that. It just knows who they are, logs them right in, and they're into the portal. So it's quick and easy, not necessarily the best user experience from an external point of view. So often then we see forms-based authentication. Well, let's put an HTML login form in front of SharePoint, could be Active Directory or SQL under the hood using .NET providers, and set that up from an authentication perspective. Or the third option for on-premises is what we're calling federated identity. We're going to talk a lot more about this because this is actually our preferred option, but this is where SharePoint becomes what's called a relying party, and it passes the authentication responsibility over to what's called a trusted identity provider. That could be Active Directory Federation Services or any number of other SAML-compliant identity providers. So those are our three options from an on-premises perspective. Now, what about an Office 365 point of view? A little bit different there. The first one is kind of like the on-premises Windows authentication, but here we're using Azure Active Directory. So basically, you have an account in the cloud with Office 365 as part of your subscription, and you have a username and a password associated with that. There's no integration to on-premises. It's strictly a completely separate, independent account in the cloud. So that's obviously the easiest to get going, not necessarily the best user experience. So most organizations, as they get going on Office 365, one of the first things they do is set up what's called DIRSync, and basically that takes your on-premises identity in Active Directory and pushes it up into Azure Active Directory. You still have a second account up there, but it's synchronized to your on-premise account. You still have to log in a second time because we're not doing a single sign-on experience at this point. So you can do what's called a password sync, where it pushes the password hash, so a secure version of the password, up into the cloud. So at least you don't need to remember a second password. And the third option, again, similar to what we talked about on the on-premises, is federation. And here, Office 365 becomes the relying party. And again, you're using an identity provider through federation to do the authentication. You can still do user sync. You can still connect your on-premise identity with the Azure Active Directory account, because you still need that account in the cloud for Office 365 to use. That's what the subscription is tied off of. So those are our three options from a 365 perspective. So if we want to use a extranet, what's the easy way to get going on that? Well, let's imagine we have our on-premises SharePoint. We're going to use the out-of-the-box Windows authentication scenario. We just want to open up port 443, so we have a secure SSL connection externally to our SharePoint site. And it may be to a portion of our farm or to all of it. It depends on how we want to expose that out. We could use something fancier like a reverse proxy, where the login experience can be a little more improved. But with the basic out-of-the-box, what you see is the login box we have on the right there. That's just our browser challenge coming up. You can't customize that or change that because it's actually the local browser that's doing that prompt up. It's asking for a username and a password. Has to be Active Directory. There's no forgotten password. There's no change password, self-registration, some of the things that you're going to want to see typically from an extranet perspective. And really, IT needs to run all this. They need to set up those users and manage those users. They could have them in a separate AD if they want to keep them separate from your on-premises account from a security point of view, but it's somewhat cumbersome to manage that. There's no real mechanism even for getting the credentials out to the users. Typically this means that credentials get plain text emailed out to them, which is obviously a security risk, and because they can't change their password, that well-known password that's in their email body is there forever. So it's not an ideal situation, but it is possible to do that. I mean, you can start to custom build some things around here, like the ability to reset a forgotten password, to do a chain password, but there's third-party products that allow you to do that as well. So that's our first scenario, just doing an out-of-the-box Windows authentication extranet. The second scenario that I want to take you through is using Office 365, and this is really where Microsoft is pushing a lot of people from an extranet point of view. You may not be aware, but as a subscriber for Office 365 and SharePoint Online, you get up to 10,000 free external users that you can invite in through external sharing into your Office 365 SharePoint Online. The caveat is that you have to use the Microsoft login form, the form that we have on the right there, and those external users have to have a Microsoft account themselves, or they have to be an actual Office 365 subscriber themselves. Not within your subscription, but they must have their own subscription or have a Hotmail account or an Outlook.com account or such. Because they're going to log in through that Microsoft login form using those Microsoft credentials. Now, there's some caveats here. I mean, you don't have any control exactly over what account is used to accept the invitations. When you turn on the external sharing feature in your 365 tenant, what it allows is people who have the right to manage permissions can then invite external users. So they go into the 365 interface, they click share, they put one or more email addresses in of who they want to share that out to, and 365 will email out an invitation to those people. But regardless of what emails you've sent them to, whoever receives that can forward it on, can use whatever Microsoft account they want to use to then connect into your extranet. You don't have control over how that connection is made. So if you want to make sure that these people come from a corporate account, then you don't have that ability to do that. They can decide, well, I'm going to use my personal Outlook.com account to connect to your extranet. And I may leave that organization, but I still have that Outlook.com account. Therefore, I still have access to your extranet unless somehow you find out that I'm not there anymore and remove me from your system. So it's not great from a governance point of view. Microsoft is really positioning this as what they call, quote, light extranet. And those are their terms in terms of how they describe it. And I would agree that if you've got a fairly simple scenario, you want to invite some people in and share, it's a great way to do that from an ad hoc point of view. But it's kind of in the same realm as doing a Dropbox, sort of doing an informal, personal extranet rather than a properly governed, full organizational extranet. So we want to take it up a step and say, okay, well, let's look at a better experience around here. Well, forms-based authentication, that allows us to create a nice branded, friendly login form. Now, this is taking us back on-premise. So we started out with the on-premise Windows authentication. We said external sharing in Office 365. Coming back to on-premise for this one, saying, well, we can spin up forms-based authentication here. It does require some custom development to build that pretty branded form in there, but ultimately at the end of the day, when you've done that, the users can be stored outside of the corporate Active Directory. You can keep them in SQL or a separate AD, it's up to you. It is a fair bit of work, though. The installation is quite manual. There's a lot of reconfiguration of web config files on the SharePoint farm itself. You have to be very careful when you do that. You've got to make sure you do the appropriate changes to each of a number of different web configs in each of your farm servers to make sure that that all hangs together and works. Now, we have a product that we're going to touch on called our Extranet User Manager. Our prior versions of it did the forms-based authentication. We've now switched to a federation. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. But it helps in the sense that it takes you through a wizard-based install. It deals with the installation, getting all those configs updated. It provides the login form and the branding, the self-registration, forgotten password, user management features in there. So that is an option there. You can roll it yourself, or you can look at third-party products like ourselves to help you with that. Certainly this becomes a much better user experience for those external users coming in. But our fourth option I want to talk about, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time today, is on the federation side. So you can federate through Active Directory Federation Services. That's a standard feature that comes with Microsoft Windows Server. And it supports the full spectrum. So whether you're on SharePoint 2010, 2013, or Office 365, and we have folks from all of those areas on the call here today, this model applies equally well to all of those. Now, if you do it with the out-of-the-box Active Directory Federation Services, that's the login form that you get on the right there. You can do some changes to that. It is your own form. It is in your own servers. There's some light branding that's possible through that. You can change colors. You can change images. You can't go too far from a user experience point of view. You can have separate ADFS for both internal and external users. So if you want to keep your external users separate and outside of your corporate domain, you can certainly do that with here. Another big advantage, though, is this isn't just about SharePoint. This is an industry standard way of doing sign-on that supports other claimsware applications as well. So you can then get into single sign-on where your users could come to your SharePoint Extranet portal, authenticate and log in, and have a link in there that takes them to one of your other systems. And they don't get challenged for credentials again because they've already signed in if that other application can consume the claims and work with this from a single sign-on point of view. Now, we still need to deal with the registration, the onboarding, the password management, so you need something around that. And the home realm discovery, and I'm going to talk more about that. How do we figure out where we're going to sign you on, whether you're an internal user or an external user? That can still be confusing for users out of the box. So that takes us to our last option. I mentioned we've got a product called Extranet User Manager. Not a sales pitch here per se, but I do want to make people aware that we deal with a lot of those situations. So we are using the same federation model. So again, whether you're SharePoint 2010 or 2013 on premises or running Office 365, we can support all of those experiences. But now we have a fully brandable user experience. The example of the login form on the right there, I'm going to take you through some actual customer demos and show you that. but we can do some further customization. One of the things we get asked a lot is clients want their external users to log in with their email address. Sounds like a simple thing. It's actually fairly difficult in a number of the scenarios I showed you. The Windows Authentication, the ADFS don't support that. Forms-based does. Our federation model does as well, that they can just have to remember their password, not their username, because their username is their email address. We can do automatic login for internal users so they don't even see the challenge prompt. The self-registration process, I'll take you through examples of that. A welcome email that you can set your credentials so you can securely get your credentials to your external users. Odds are they're going to forget their passwords. Extranet users are often infrequent. You have to have some sort of forgotten password reset mechanism in there. So I'll show you our approach. There's a number of ways that you could do that. But also, this idea of delegation of user management is very important. At the end of the day, the business wants to own this relationship with the external users. IT shouldn't be in the middle, setting up AD accounts and managing that. So how do we make that simpler? How do we let the business own that themselves, even from a group management point of view? Could even be externally. You may want to delegate out to your external organizations and say, well, you manage your own external users into our extranet. That actually is a very good model in a lot of situations, and I'll show you some examples of that. This idea of single sign-on is getting more and more important. People have multiple applications. It may not even just be their own. Other software as service, just like SharePoint Online, maybe they need to get into Salesforce.com or some other SaaS solution. As long as those are claims aware, and pretty much all SaaS applications these days are, you can provide that single sign-on experience, but also provide a much improved governance over your extranet. So let's quickly go through a couple of the screens that you're going to need to think about from an extranet perspective, and then we'll dive a little deeper into those. So first is registration. How do you get your external users into the system to begin with? How do you even know who they are? Now, you may have an invitation only where your business says, well, I know who my external users are, and I just want to invite them into my extranet. I don't need a self-registration form. We see that fairly often. That's not an uncommon scenario. But honestly, more common is clients want some sort of external registration form. How do we get the users to self-identify and then take me through some sort of approval process? So this is the out-of-the-box form that comes with our product, but these are some examples of richer extensions that we've built for different clients. So it's probably a good moment here. Let me flip over to the browser and take you through a couple of those scenarios. So the first one I want to do is Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada. This is a great organization here in Canada about helping underprivileged kids throughout communities across the country. So national office point of view is fairly small. They're only about 35 staff, but they've got 103 clubs across the country, about 700 different locations, and they've got somewhere around 5,000 staff and volunteers that are working with the kids. So if we come into the site, it is a bilingual site, so it's both English and French, our official languages here in Canada. And it's a very rich public-facing website hosted on SharePoint 2010. But if we come into the members section here, we can see I get a login form coming up right away. This is a branded version of our out-of-the-box login form. So obviously the user experience is very important. We want it to feel like you're still in the website. Let's say I don't have credentials on here, though. I click on the Register Here link. And we're going to provide links to all these sites as part of the deck, so you'll be able to actually go into these sites yourself. They are full public live sites. We can see that we're looking to capture some information as part of the registration. Actually, not a lot about the person from a personal information point of view. All we want is a name and an email. The rest is really about their role and relationship with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada, including what club you're affiliated with. And interestingly, from an approval point of view, the way this works is you actually put in your own approver's email. First glance, that may seem very insecure, but the reality is that the approver has to already have an account on the members portal. So they have to be somebody who already has the keys to go in, and then they can approve somebody else. So this is great for an organization like this where they want a very organic adoption. National office doesn't have a good sense of who those 5,000 staff and volunteers are at each of the locations that run very autonomously. So let them self-identify and go through the approval. Basically, if you know somebody who's already a member of the portal, ask them, and they can let you in. So that works really well from that point of view. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, somebody like Transamerica Life, again, a public-facing site on SharePoint 2010, You can see here there's an advisor login link. If I go ahead and click on that, again, we get a login form. Click here to register. It's going to ask me a lot more questions here because at the end of the day, this is about the 30,000 advisors across the country that sell the Transamerica Life insurance and investment products. They're going to have access through single sign-on to policyholder information, to sales commission reporting systems. There's about a dozen different systems they get access to as part of the portal. Obviously, we're going to want to make sure that we not only capture the correct information, but there's a whole department at Transamerica who's tasked with vetting and qualifying and making sure that the right people are registering and coming in to the site. And we take one in the middle here, Public Health Ontario. So this is a provincial government health organization responsible for testing, disease control, and reporting of information back to the public at large, but also primarily the healthcare professionals across the province. So again, SharePoint 2010 public-facing website. We can see here at the top we've got a login and register. If I click on the register link, again, it's going to ask me all my information through here, but it's also going to ask me details like, do I belong to a public health unit? So these are municipal organizations. There's 38 of them across the province that staff work for that are not part of Public Health Ontario. But if somebody says, well, I belong to, say, the Toronto Public Health unit, it's going to go through a secondary approval process. And ultimately, it's actually going to drive that approval back to Toronto Public Health. So it's actually delegated it back externally to say, PHO doesn't know who works for Toronto Public Health. Toronto Public Health knows who works for them. So make them the approver. There's certain folks at Toronto Public Health who then get the approval notices from the registration to say, does this person actually work for you? Yes, okay, what sorts of things should they be able to do? And that will then light up the appropriate rights within here. So there's more examples we can go through, but that gives you a quick flavor of what that registration process can look like. So behind the scenes, what's going to happen, and we're going to take you through a live demo of this, that an approval email will get sent out to say, hey, somebody just registered on the site, you need to edit their record, set their status to active in order to approve them. So this is the form that people would use to do that approval process. And ultimately, the result of an approved user is a welcome email. Hey, thanks for signing up on the Extranet. You have an account. Your username is this. Typically, that would be an email address in most of our implementations. And here's a link to set your password. We want to make that secure, so we put a time expiry on it saying, well, you've got 24 hours. And you can define what that period is to receive this email, click on that link, and set your password. If you miss that window, you're not dead in the water. You can restart the process by requesting a new email be sent to you. But those tokens are time expiring. They're also one-time use. So if somebody sees this email later, it's of no value, no use to them. They can't then hack into your account through there. You have to be able to set your passwords. When you click on that link in the email, you get presented with this page here. Ultimately, you're going to come to a login form. And we need to deal with the forgotten passwords process as well. So again, fairly simple process. Type in your email address. We'll find your account, send you an email. It'll have a link very much like the welcome email to allow you to reset your password from there. You can never recover your password. You can just reset it to a new value. And the other thing is that administrators should never have access to end users' passwords either. You'll find that most users, I would include myself in that, tend to reuse passwords on different sites. Not best practices, but it's the reality. Most of us don't use password management software. So we need to be very careful with the passwords that our external users entrust with us. We can't be providing administrator access to see that. They need to be securely stored in the underlying authentication store. Okay, so we're about halfway through. What I want to do now is switch gears and get into live demo. I showed you a couple of the registration pages, but let's actually go through that whole process, starting from registration through to login. This is going to be in SharePoint 2013 on premises for our first walkthrough here. Let me give you a little more background. The sites are publicly available, so you can go to https://productdemo13.envisionit.com. You'll see the same pages. You can go through the same registration. We'll get the same notifications of somebody registering on there. So as I mentioned, it's an on-premises SharePoint 2013. Uses ADFS for internal users, and the external users are stored in a separate AD. They authenticate through an open source product I'll talk more about called ThinkTexture Identity Server, and they're managed with our Envision IT Extranet User Manager. So without further ado, let me go over to that site there. So I'm actually going to be wearing two different hats here. I mean, we've got the public-facing site here in my Internet Explorer session, but I'm going to use this as my internal user, as my approver. I'm going to open up another session through Chrome. Let me go to that same URL. So I'm at the same spot here. Actually, I'm still signed in. Let me sign out. Close my browser. I'll start that fresh. One thing to be aware of, SharePoint 2013 isn't great about signing you out. Even though you've closed your browser, it often keeps that session open. So sign out process is something that we've actually extended on and customized as well to make that work a little better from a SharePoint perspective. Okay, so I'm in the site now. You can all see this as well. If you were to hit this URL, the top-level site is anonymously available. You don't need any credentials to get that. You can see here a sign-in link, which is standard welcome menu from SharePoint. So we haven't done anything custom on this site. We've kept it very vanilla and out of the box. So whether I click on that sign-in link or this access the private area, which is going to drive me down to a private subsite where we've turned off anonymous access, it's going to force authentication to happen. If I don't have an account yet, I can go straight into the register for a new account. But let's actually drive into the access to private area. So I'm not currently authenticated, so SharePoint has redirected over to our login form. We're actually on a slightly different URL now. So we'll talk more about how the federation works, but it's basically bounced me from SharePoint to our identity provider, which is on the product demo 13 eum.envisionit.com URL. So if I had credentials, I could go ahead and enter those and log in and return back into the site. But let's imagine that we're a brand new user, first time visiting, we need to click on the register here link. So here's our out-of-the-box login form. I could fill in all the fields, only the first three are required in the demo example that we have here, which is the name and email. So I'll just go ahead and skip ahead. We put a CAPTCHA in here just to keep the robots away, and go ahead and register. So this hasn't actually created an account for me just yet. What it's done is put a record into our SQL database saying, hey, somebody's just registered, but they're still pending approval. Somebody needs to go through the approval process and review that and make sure it makes sense and go from there. So let me bring my Outlook up on the screen here. We've got a number of emails that have come through here. So the top two are the recent ones that just came through off of that, saying, hey, oh, somebody else is approving as well. So let me go to the one to me as the person registering on the site. This is just thanking me for requesting an account and letting me know that, hey, we've got your request. You're going to have to wait for a second email once your account is approved. Now the other one here is saying, oh, here's somebody new who has signed up on the site as pcarson4 at envisionit365.com and need to edit their record and set their status to active. So let me go ahead and click on that link. It's going to take me to Internet Explorer, and I'm not currently signed in through IE either. So what I want to do here is use my corporate email address. We've got a rule in our installation that says if you see an email domain at envisionit.com, that means that's an internal corporate user. We don't want to log in through the extranet. We actually want to direct to the internal ADFS to do that login. So it's going to flash by fairly quickly, but when I tab off of that, we can see that we went to adfs.envisionit.com, and then we bounced back into our EUM product there. So it went to the identity provider internally, which is ADFS, authenticated me, and then brought me back to our administration console. So let's actually just search up that user. And we can see here's my Peter Carson 4 account that's currently pending approval. Go ahead and click on that, and I can see all the information that the user entered into the registration form. So whatever internal business process I need to go through to validate, to say, yes, this is somebody that should come into our extranet, I need to go through that. Our system doesn't make that decision for you. Ultimately, you need to make a business decision saying, yes, this is somebody that should come into the site. Therefore, I will change their status from pending approval to active and assign them to whichever groups are appropriate through here. These are not SharePoint groups. These are the underlying identity provider groups, but we can assign permissions to them in SharePoint. So we've got one called SharePoint that gives you rights into the site. So you can manage all of your permissions through here once you've got your SharePoint set up once. Your business owners, your group owners that are doing this approval process don't need to worry about granting any specific permissions in SharePoint. They just put people into the right group, and away it goes from there. Let me go ahead and save that. So at this point, what it's doing is it's actually creating the account in the underlying Active Directory, not our corporate AD, the separate one that's out in the DMZ, and sending the welcome email out to the user saying, hey, you've been approved, now you can come into the site. So let's come back over to my email here. And here's my welcome email. So welcome Peter Carson 4. We need to set a password before we can come in. What I want to do here is I'm actually going to right-click and copy that hyperlink because I don't want to go to IE, my default browser. I want to bring that into my Chrome session here. So paste that in, and you can see it's taking me to this forgotten password update password page with a token in it. So that token we've generated as our security piece, you need that from the email in order to come to this page here and set your new password. So whether you do it through our product or you roll your own, you really need to think about this process of how do we get the credentials out to the external users. Emailing them plain text passwords is a really bad idea, so you need some method to securely set those through there. If we come back here and I put that same URL in again, we can see here's what happens if you try and reuse it. It says, well, that token is expired. It's already been used. You need to go through here and reset your password to get a new token that way. So I could actually put in that same email address again, request a new password email. This is the forgotten password process. So imagine some time has elapsed. I don't remember my credentials. By requesting a new password email, it doesn't change my account. If I suddenly have an epiphany and I remember my password, my old one, I can still go ahead and use it. If we come back to my inbox here, in a second we'll see another email come through, which will be the forgotten password email. So again, we can see there's a timer expiry on that. This one's a little different. We're actually 9:40 in the morning here in Eastern Standard Time, so we've given a 2-hour window to respond to that. Okay, so let's come back to the site. So imagine that I no longer forgot, I remember my password, I want to come back to the site here. When I set my password, that didn't actually log me in, it just set my credentials, so the first thing I have to do is actually enter those credentials again to gain access into the site. So we're going from the identity provider back into our EOM product, and one of the things that we do is we provide a landing page. So you may have a very extensive extranet with many, many different sites in there. How do you guide people into the right spot within the site? So what we do is we provide this page here, and it basically looks at the current user and says, what sites do you have access to? And I'll build a tree view of those so you can drive into those sites. In fact, if you only have access to one site, we don't even show this page. It just auto-redirects into that site. So it's nice because you can give your external users all this one URL, and it will figure out where to direct those people to depending on their rights into your extranet from there. Let's go down into that private subsite. That was where we were originally trying to get to when we started the demo. So we can see now we're signed in as that pcarson4 at envisionit.365.com account. I was signed in through that identity provider that we created, and I can now do whatever I'm allowed to do from a permissions point of view within there. So that admin console that we were showing you before, where I did the approval, I don't have any rights in that. There's different roles that you can assign, whether you're a group owner or a group editor or a configuration editor that can do all things within there. This particular user, though, all we did was put them in that SharePoint group. That doesn't give them any rights into this part of the site here. So let's come back to our page. There's a site tree that we already showed that explains where you can go in the SharePoint structure. I can come back and change my settings. So you're going to want a way for people who have self-registered to be able to come back and change their information. Maybe they get married, they change their last name, their phone number changes. You do have to decide, though, should we allow them to change their email address? Most of our clients say no because they've created a relationship with that external user. relative to their employer. They want to use their corporate email address because they're working for a partner company, and they want to know if that person no longer works for that company, they can't come in here and just change this to be their Gmail or their Hotmail account and continue accessing the extranet from there. But typically we don't allow email change, but we support it. If you want to allow your users to change their email, like the Boys and Girls Clubs of Canada, there's no reason why somebody shouldn't be able to change their email address for their account there. We certainly support that there. So you can decide, again, what fields you want displayed on here, what business rules you want applied around that, and such from there. You should also have the ability to change your password. It shouldn't just be a forgotten password process, but maybe I haven't forgotten my password, but I like doing strong password controls, and I can enter my old password and my new password and go ahead and update it. Out of the box, SharePoint doesn't provide that ability. So if you want to be able to do that, you need something around here. Some of our extranets also have password change policies that you want to set a warning and a forced password change timing on there. We support that as well. You can define that, after 30 days, you're going to encourage people to change their password, and after 45 days, you're going to refuse them entry into their extranet unless they've changed their password. You have to think carefully about that because often extranets are infrequently used. If people only come in every 3 months and you force them to change their password every 30 days, it means every time they log in, they're going to have to choose a new password. It gets very annoying for your users from that point of view. If you're a very secure extranet that's frequently being used, like the Transamerica one where the advisors are in there literally on a daily basis, that's a different story. I can even go into other applications. We saw some of that when we were coming to the landing admin or to the site tree. Those are actually applications out of SharePoint. We actually have a sample ASP.NET application that we provide as part of our package just to show people, hey, if you're building your own custom applications, how do you wire them in and have the authentication happen? This is a very, very simple application. Basically what it does is it inspects the SAML security claims token that was provided by the login process and saying what's inside that. What's the username, what's the email address, what groups, like that SharePoint group, do they belong to, all the properties that user get displayed up through here. So it doesn't achieve much other than illustrating how do you wire it together. So you could build your own applications. You could take your existing applications and retrofit them to be what's called claims aware, and then you can leverage our authentication as part of that. Oops. All right, so let's switch gears here now, come back to our PowerPoint deck. So that's a little more background from the demo point of view. And let's just recap over the different scenarios that we talked about earlier on. So we had basically 5 different scenarios. Sorry, just grabbing a sip of water. So if we start at the left with Windows Authentication, the Office 365 external sharing, those are sort of the out-of-the-box experience for either on-premise or in the cloud. Then we had forms-based authentication, then the ADFS Federation, which is using the Microsoft tools, and then our Extranet User Manager Federation, which was the example I showed you in the demo. And this takes you through some of the different things to consider from a technical point of view between those scenarios. I mean, obviously, the Windows Off is pretty standard install. You need to set up some AD trusts if you want to have separate Active Directory for your external users. There's a lot of firewall ports, about 13 ports you have to open up between your DMZ and your internal network. So security folks typically don't like that. You can't store the users in SQL. They have to be in Active Directory. IT needs to manage those users. But you do have control over those external accounts. You don't have any single sign-on to other systems unless you're using some sort of reverse proxy that provides that single sign-on experience. So not the best. Office 365 external sharing, very easy to get going. There's no AD trust, there's no firewall ports. This is all running out in the cloud, so it's very simple from that point of view. You don't have to worry about IT managing those users and those passwords. You do have to worry about all your business users managing that and what that looks like. There's not a lot of governance around that or control around it. You don't even have control of exactly what accounts are being connected up into your system. And there's no single sign-on to your other systems. Forum space, we mentioned there's a lot of work to be done in your on-premises to set that up. It doesn't require AD trust, at least if you're using our product as part of that. There are still a couple of firewall ports that you have to open, not 13, only 3, but still something needs to be opened up there. You can keep your users in either AD or SQL. If you're using our Extranet User Manager product, IT doesn't need to manage those, but we don't provide single sign-on through that model to other systems. Then we get into the 2 federations. It's actually the same setup for both of them from a SharePoint point of view. There's a PowerShell script that you run to set up that trust to the identity provider. There's no actual AD trust required. There's no firewall port. So security folks love this approach. It's a very secure way of doing that. If you're using ADFS, those users obviously have to be in Active Directory. In our product, they could be in SQL as well. And again, if you're using our product, then IT doesn't need to manage those users and passwords. You've got control over those external accounts, and you've got that single sign-on experience. So that's really the ultimate, we feel, in terms of the approach from an Extranet point of view. So we've talked a fair bit about this federation idea, and I've mentioned some terms like the trusted identity provider that does the authentication. I want to take you a little deeper, though, into what does that actually mean. So SAML is the security asset markup language. It's like HTML. It's an industry-wide standard. It's not a Microsoft thing. It's not our thing. It's something that every vendor is signed on to and is supporting. Active Directory Federation Services is probably the best-known SAML provider out there. Think Texture Identity Server is an open-source product that we use as part of our implementation. But it could be things like social identities, Facebook, Google+, LinkedIn, Microsoft accounts. Those can all be SAML compliant providers as well. You can do single sign-on from your Facebook account into your system as well. That's certainly possible. What you use under the hood to store the users, completely up to you. It could be Active Directory, it could be SQL, could be something else. As long as at the end of the day it generates a SAML compliant token, that's all that matters. And then relying parties like SharePoint trust that token and then provide the authorization based off of the identity that comes in from that token. And that can provide that single sign-on experience that we're talking about. Any SAML claims compliant system, claims aware system, not just SharePoint, can then be wired up to work with that. So let's talk a bit more about ADFS. This is the standard out-of-the-box Microsoft. So we've got ADFS servers, which are connected typically to your on-premises domain controllers. If you've got internal users, they're just going to use Windows Authentication. They're not even going to see a login form and get authenticated through ADFS. If you're coming in from outside and you want your staff or your external users to be able to use ADFS, you need what's called an ADFS proxy. In the new world from Microsoft with Windows Server 2012 R2, that's now called the Web Application Proxy. Is a way to expose that in. This is the ADFS login form that you would see. We can show examples of that. Your internal users should never see this. It should just automatically log them in. But if you're external, you'll see it. You can brand that within some limits around that. We look at a broader federation. If you've got our internal users that are hitting the DMZ farm in the middle from their corporate network on the left, it'll redirect back to their on-premises ADFS, create a token, and give that back to the SharePoint farm in the middle. We've got our external users coming in from the outside, from the public internet. Maybe we don't want them coming against our corporate AD. That can come down against AD, SQL, whatever the case may be, do the authentication, provide those credentials back to SharePoint from there. So let's look a little deeper as to what actually happens in that authentication process. So we've got a user that browses an application. Say, for argument's sake, it's SharePoint that they're hitting that's a relying party. SharePoint says, I don't know who you are because you've never authenticated to me in this session, so I'm going to redirect back to you and say you're not authenticated, and you need to redirect your browser to the identity provider. It could be ADFS, it could be our Extranet User Manager, it could be Facebook, whatever the case may be. That's going to then go through whatever challenge it needs to do, validate it against some repository, it could be Active Directory, it could be something else, and everything passes, it creates what's called a SAML token, and it passes that back to the browser. You'll see there's no direct connection between the relying party and the identity provider. It's all done through the user's browser. So the user's browser gets the SAML security token back, and it submits that to the relying party, in this case SharePoint. SharePoint says, hey, I trust that token because I've got a trust relationship with that identity provider, therefore I can return the page back to you. So how does that trust get established? What does that look like? There's a number of certificates that are happening in this conversation. So we first got SSL certs. So each of the sides, whether it's the SharePoint or the identity provider, when they're communicating through the browser with that end user, it needs to be over an SSL site. That definitely should be encrypted. But then there's this SAML token that gets generated, and it's basically a public-private key pair. So the identity provider has a private key, and it signs that token. And as part of setting up the trust, you take the public key and you run some PowerShell, and you install that key into the relying party, in our case, into SharePoint. SharePoint can then take that token, validate it with the public key, and say, did this token come from that identity provider that I trust? And if anybody's interfered with it or has tried to create their own dummy SAML token, because it wasn't signed with that private key, SharePoint will say, well, that's not a valid SAML token. If it passes, then everything's good, and it can trust the information that's inside of that token about who the user is, what groups they belong to, and such, and make its decisions from there. You can also encrypt that token. We typically don't do this because the communication is already encrypted through the SSL, but it is an option that you can have as an additional layer in there. So I mentioned we use ThinkTexture as our identity server rather than ADFS. I want to talk a bit more about why we did that decision. What does that look like? So this is an open source product. The link is there to go to their site. And because it's open source, we can pull that down. We can tweak and adjust that code to customize it. So we can do very rich branding around that. This idea about being able to log in with your email address instead of your AD username is a very important one. So we were able to do that. And we actually engaged and hired ThinkTexture to help us with this work. So we didn't go out to start hacking their code. We worked very closely with them to say, okay, this is what we want to achieve. How do we do that? How do we branch off yours into our own custom version? Under the hood, we can use SQL instead of Active Directory, and we can do what's called the home realm discovery as part of the login form as well. So let's talk a bit more about that. And you may not have noticed this going through as we're going through the demo, but there was a number of decision points that were happening as I was signing onto the system. So we want to make it as seamless as possible for both internal and external users signing into the system. But we don't know who those are as they're first coming in. So the first thing that we do is we allow you to configure a set of IP addresses that you define as internal. They could be true internal like 192.168, which are private IP addresses. We know that you're inside the firewall. They could be a range of external IPs. It's up to you to define them. So when a user first comes in and they hit our login form, we say, are you coming from an internal IP address? If the answer to that is yes, then we want to redirect you past the login form and just kick you over to your corporate ADFS. And if that's wired up properly, you shouldn't see that ADFS login form. It should just do a Windows auth login and take you right into SharePoint. The beauty of that is that if you get a deep link in your email into your SharePoint extranet as a staff member, you click that link, you never see a login form, you just get to where that link was pointing in SharePoint. That's the user experience that your internal users expect and should get on your extranet. Now, if they're coming in from outside, though, we don't know whether they're an external or an internal user. So we have to present them with the login form. And this is what we saw when I was logging in the first time through the Chrome, is we look at the email domain. So if I log in as peter@envisionit.com, we see the envisionit.com, we say, oh, that's an internal email domain. I'm, again, going to redirect you over to ADFS. At this point, you may not log in because ADFS needs to get your credentials. You have to put your password in there, but it is your corporate AD account that you're using. You don't have a separate account in the extranet. And then you're into SharePoint. And if not, though, we need to capture your password, authenticate you, and then take you into SharePoint. So it's all happening under the hood, but it's all about targeting the user down the appropriate path and making it as simple as possible from that point of view. So I've only got a few minutes left here. I want to do a quick demo from an Office 365 point of view. I'm not going to go through all the way from registration to login, but what I want to do is take you through the experience here. So what we've got, again, this is publicly available, the umdev.sharepoint.com site. Anytime you see .sharepoint.com, you know that that's a SharePoint Online site. It has to be under that URL using that certificate to be hosted by Microsoft. We've got EUM installed separate from that, and we've worked with the engineering team out in Redmond to set up our tenant so it auto-redirects to our login form. So you never actually see the Microsoft login form, which is a feature you can now set up tenant by tenant. So let's come back to our Chrome session here. I'm just going to close out completely and open a new Chrome browser and go to that URL. So I'm hitting eumdev.sharepoint.com. We'll give it a second, and you can see that it redirected me to eum.eitdev.org. So it said, okay, you're hitting SharePoint Online. Microsoft says if you're hitting that URL, I need to send you over here for you to log in. So again, you can have a fully branded experience, not seeing the Microsoft Home Realm Discovery or login form anywhere in that process. Again, we won't go through the registration again, but it's the same process we did before. I go ahead and log in. Whoops, I have to use the right password. And it redirects me back to eumdev.sharepoint.com where I first wanted to go. So now I can see I'm actually in Office 365, signed in as that Carson 4 user that we've created there. So it's actually showing me the underlying Azure Active Directory account, but from a login point of view, I'm actually logging in with my own personal email address that I've registered on there. That single sign-on experience actually applies even between SharePoint Online and Office 365. So if we wired these together, I could jump from my Office 365 tenant to my on-premises. If they were both using the same identity provider, I wouldn't get another challenge and go from there. Likewise, if I have my own internal applications that I'm exposing, I could jump from Office 365 to those applications, provide a single sign-on experience through that. My internal users can still use ADFS, so they use their corporate AD accounts. We authenticate through ThinkTexture for the external users against AD, and we manage those users with the same Extranet User Manager product that I was showing you before. So I'm going to wrap up, come back to questions. We've only got a couple minutes left here. If you've got questions about what you saw from an Extranet User Manager, this is the URL for our site, /EUM will take you right into the product page. Hugh Davidson is our salesperson on the Extranet side. He's actually on the call answering questions. This is his contact information here. Happy to go through an on-premise installation. We're actually going to be launching in the next month or so a full software as a service where we'll actually host this on your behalf in Azure, make it much easier to get trials up and going. We can do a 30-day evaluation as part of that. As I mentioned, we'll have links to all the sites that we're looking at through here, and we'll get the last couple of questions if we've got any outstanding from there.
Hi, Peter. So we do have one question here. One of our attendees has SharePoint on-premise in their extranet. They're using Azure's new access control service to authenticate their external users, and they're wondering if that's a configuration that we support.
So there's a number of ways that could go. So the product can be used strictly to manage the users, and then you could continue to use ACS to do the authentication, or you could replace ACS with our login form, and it's up to you as to whether you want to continue to use ACS or not, and just leverage us from a forgotten password and from a registration perspective. If you're using ACS to federate with other external providers, like ACS is often used to allow authentication through Facebook, through Google+, that's something that we're still thinking about how we support that in terms of how do we do the registration process through an externally federated social identity. So not a straight answer, but there's a number of options there.
Okay, another question here. Within the Office 365 scenario, do all users need a SharePoint Online license?
So that's an important question. I should have raised that previously. So from a licensing point of view, if you use the external sharing option that I described, there is no licensing required for that. If you use our product and you want to maintain that whole user experience around the registration and sign-on, you do need to have a license for those external users, yes. Depending on the type of organization, we work a lot with registered charities and educational where they actually get those licenses for free. But if you're a for-profit or a standard government organization, yes, you are going to have to purchase those licenses for those external users.
Okay, Peter, and just a follow-up to the Azure ACS question. He was just mentioning that the user profile is stored in CRM and the username and passwords are stored in SQL. And that was just, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add there.
We do integration in with CRM. I didn't mention in the Boys and Girls Clubs situation, when people register, we're updating not only the Extranet but also their Microsoft Dynamics CRM information as well. So we can talk about custom integrations and what that looks like from a profile point of view.
I think we're good, Peter. So if you want to take a couple minutes to wrap up.
I think we're there. Helen, did you want to do any closing remarks?
Yes, I do, and I just want to thank Peter for a great webinar today. Thank you very much, Peter, for taking the time out today to present to our European SharePoint community. I would also like to thank all our attendees for joining us also. We have a recording of this webinar available online next week, and we will email you with the details of how to download it. To find out more about this webinar and all our webinars in the series, go to bit.ly/SharePoint webinars. So I'd just like to say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.